In the chaotic months following a failed and still contested coup attempt in Indonesia in late September 1965, one of the 20th century's largest mass killings unfolded largely out of international view, transforming a political crisis into a systematic extermination that would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands and permanently reshape Southeast Asia's Cold War alignment. Because what began as a power struggle within the Indonesian military rapidly became an anti-communist purge on a scale that rivaled the era's most notorious atrocities, yet was conducted without formal declarations, international intervention, or sustained global scrutiny. And at the center of this transformation stood a convergence of domestic fear, military ambition, and Cold War strategy that turned Indonesia into a proving ground for containment through annihilation. And the immediate trigger was the mysterious abduction and killing of several senior generals on the night of September 30th, an event blamed almost instantly on the Indonesian Communist Party, known as the PKI, despite the absence of conclusive evidence and the persistence of conflicting interpretations. And this attribution mattered profoundly because the PKI was not a marginal insurgent movement, but one of the largest communist parties in the world outside the Soviet bloc, with millions of members and sympathizers embedded in unions, peasant organizations, and cultural institutions, operating legally under the protection of President Sukarno, whose post-colonial vision sought to balance nationalism, religion, and communism while maintaining independence from both Cold War blocs. A balancing act that alarmed Western governments who viewed Indonesia's size, resources, and strategic location as too important to risk drifting toward the left. And when the generals were killed, the political vacuum was filled rapidly by Major General Suharto, who moved decisively to seize control of the army and frame the events as an existential communist threat, a framing that unlocked extraordinary violence by presenting the purge not as repression, but as national self-defense. And within weeks, soldiers, militias, and civilian death squads began arresting, detaining, and executing suspected communists across Java, Bali, Sumatra, and beyond, targeting not only party officials but teachers, artists, farmers, ethnic Chinese Indonesians, and anyone associated, however loosely, with leftist organizations. And the killings were not spontaneous eruptions of mob violence, but organized campaigns enabled by military coordination, lists of names, and logistical support, revealing a level of planning that contradicted later portrayals of the violence as uncontrollable chaos. And this organization intersected directly with Cold War geopolitics, because as the purge accelerated, Western governments responded not with alarm, but with quiet approval, interpreting the destruction of the PKI as a strategic victory that removed one of the largest non-aligned communist movements from the global equation, and intelligence services provided information, communication support, and diplomatic cover that facilitated the army's campaign while shielding it from international consequence. And this support was rarely public, but deeply consequential, because it signaled to Indonesian commanders that there would be no external restraint, allowing violence to escalate without fear of sanction. And as bodies accumulated in rivers and mass graves, the purge took on a ritualized character, with executions framed as moral cleansing and survivors forced into silence by terror and stigma, creating a social environment in which participation in violence became a marker of loyalty and refusal, a potential death sentence. And this environment allowed the killings to spread rapidly through local networks, as military authority combined with civilian mobilization to produce a decentralized but coordinated extermination. And the scale of the violence defied easy accounting, because records were destroyed, witnesses silenced, and the new regime imposed an official narrative that denied or minimized the atrocities. Yet, historians estimate that between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed in a matter of months. A demographic shock that permanently altered Indonesia's political and cultural landscape. And at the international level, the response was striking for its absence, because while Western diplomats received detailed reports of the killings, they refrained from public condemnation, viewing the purge through the lens of Cold War necessity rather than humanitarian obligation. And this silence revealed a core dynamic of Cold War proxy violence, where alignment mattered more than means and mass killing could be tolerated, even welcomed, if it produced a favorable strategic outcome. And the outcome in Indonesia was decisive, because the annihilation of the PKI removed a major pillar of Sukarno's balancing strategy, isolating him politically and allowing Suharto to consolidate power gradually, sidelining the president while presenting himself as the guarantor of order, stability, and anti-communism, a posture that won rapid international recognition and economic support. And as the killings subsided into mass detention, forced labor, and long-term repression, Indonesia entered a new phase in which memory itself became dangerous, as survivors were barred from employment, education, and political participation, and public discussion of the events was criminalized, ensuring that the purge would remain both foundational and unacknowledged. And this enforced silence mattered because it transformed mass murder into a hidden architecture of the state, shaping governance through fear and exclusion rather than reconciliation. And from a Cold War perspective, the Indonesian mass killings represented a grim success, because they demonstrated that a large, strategically vital country could be realigned decisively without direct superpower intervention, using local forces to achieve outcomes that would have been politically impossible through overt invasion or occupation. And this lesson would echo in later decades as a model of anti-communist counter-revolution conducted through proxy violence. Yet the human cost of this success was staggering because it destroyed an entire political generation, traumatized millions, and entrenched a regime whose legitimacy rested on repression and erasure. And as the Cold War moved on, the Indonesian killings faded from global consciousness, overshadowed by more visible conflicts, but their legacy persisted in the form of a state built on mass violence and international complicity, demonstrating how the Cold War could reshape societies not only through war, but through silence, and how some of its most consequential battles were fought not on front lines, but in the shadows, where the destruction of a political movement could be framed as stability, and the absence of outrage became a form of endorsement, revealing that the Indonesian mass killings were not an aberration, but a brutal expression of Cold War logic at its most extreme. As the killings intensified through late 1965 and early 1966, the Indonesian purge evolved from a campaign of targeted repression into a nationwide system of elimination that revealed how quickly Cold War logic could transform fear into administrative routine, because once the army established the narrative that the nation faced an existential communist conspiracy, violence no longer required justification on a case-by-case basis, but became a generalized obligation, enforced through military command structures and replicated through civilian participation. And this shift mattered because it converted mass murder into a social process rather than a discrete series of crimes, embedding it into villages, workplaces, and families in ways that ensured both speed and deniability, as responsibility was dispersed across layers of authority while coordination remained centralized. And the Indonesian army played a decisive role in this transformation by issuing directives that encouraged local commanders to mobilize civilian groups, religious organizations, and youth militias to identify, detain, and eliminate suspects. a strategy that allowed the military to maintain plausible distance from the killings while retaining ultimate control over their scope and direction. And this use of civilian proxies was critical because it multiplied the reach of repression and bound communities to the new order through complicity, making the purge not only a political cleansing, but a mechanism for producing loyalty through shared guilt. And as the violence spread, it took on regional variations shaped by local power structures and social tensions, with especially intense killing in places like Central Java and Bali, where pre-existing rivalries, land disputes, and ideological polarization provided fertile ground for escalation, demonstrating how Cold War interventions often interacted with local grievances rather than replacing them, amplifying violence by aligning global ideology with intimate conflict. And this interaction undermined later claims that the killings were spontaneous or unavoidable, because evidence shows that where military restraint was exercised, the violence was limited, while where encouragement was explicit, the death toll soared, indicating that agency rested firmly with those who framed the purge as policy rather than reaction. And as the purge unfolded, Western intelligence agencies tracked events closely, receiving reports that detailed the scale and methods of the killings. Yet these reports did not prompt efforts to halt the violence, but were instead treated as confirmation that a strategic objective was being achieved, reinforcing a pattern seen across the Cold War, in which mass violence was tolerated so long as it produced alignment. And this tolerance extended beyond silence to active facilitation, as communication support, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic recognition flowed toward the emerging military leadership, signaling international approval and insulating the perpetrators from accountability. And this insulation mattered because it allowed the purge to proceed without fear of intervention, encouraging a tempo and scale of violence that would have been politically impossible under scrutiny. And domestically, the purge was accompanied by an aggressive propaganda campaign that dehumanized communists and portrayed their extermination as a moral duty, saturating media, schools, and religious sermons with narratives of betrayal and corruption that justified killing as purification, a process that blurred the line between belief and coercion, because participation in violence became a test of loyalty and abstention, a marker of suspicion, forcing many to choose between complicity and vulnerability. And this coercive socialization ensured that the purge left behind not only bodies, but a reordered moral landscape in which fear and silence became survival strategies. And as the PKI's organizational structures were dismantled through murder and imprisonment, the political vacuum widened, allowing the military to expand its role from guardian of order to arbiter of national identity, embedding itself into civilian administration, economic management, and cultural life under the pretext of preventing a return to chaos. And this expansion was facilitated by the systematic removal of leftist voices from unions, universities, and the arts, erasing alternative narratives and consolidating a singular version of history in which the purge was framed as salvation rather than catastrophe. And the sheer scale of detention underscored the purge's function as long-term social control rather than temporary repression, because hundreds of thousands of people were imprisoned without trial for years, forced into labor camps or internal exile, their legal status undefined and their futures contingent on loyalty assessments that could change without explanation, creating a permanent underclass marked by suspicion and exclusion. And this system of detention complemented the killings by extending the purge across time, ensuring that even those who survived remained marginalized and monitored. And internationally, the consolidation of military power was rewarded swiftly as foreign governments moved to restore aid, investment, and diplomatic engagement, interpreting the new regime as a stabilizing force that had neutralized a major communist presence. And this rapid normalization underscored the Cold War's capacity to redefine legitimacy overnight, because a state born in mass violence could be embraced as a partner so long as it aligned with strategic priorities. And as Indonesia was repositioned within the Western orbit, the killings were reframed in diplomatic discourse as unfortunate excesses or cultural outbursts, narratives that minimized intent and obscured responsibility, allowing the purge to fade from official memory even as its effects permeated every level of society. And this erasure was enforced domestically through censorship and surveillance that criminalized discussion of the events, ensuring that the purge would remain both foundational and invisible, shaping political behavior through unspoken rules and inherited fear. And this silence mattered because it transformed trauma into structure, embedding the legacy of mass killing into the state's operating system, rather than confronting it through truth or accountability. And from a Cold War perspective, this outcome illustrated how violence could be not only instrumental, but constitutive, used not merely to eliminate opponents, but to construct a new political order whose stability rested on the absence of alternatives. And as the months passed and the scale of killing declined, the purge transitioned seamlessly into a regime of repression that preserved its gains through law, education, and economic policy, locking in the results of violence without acknowledging its existence. And in doing so, Indonesia became one of the clearest examples of how the Cold War could be won, not through invasion or revolution, but through the destruction of a political movement and the normalization of silence. A victory achieved not on battlefields, but in rivers, prisons, and memories that could no longer be spoken, demonstrating that the Indonesian mass killings were not a momentary aberration, but a structural realignment achieved through terror and sustained by international indifference. As the purge reached its peak and then gradually subsided in mid-1966, the transition from mass killing to institutionalized repression revealed how thoroughly violence had been integrated into the process of state formation, because the objective was no longer merely to eliminate the PKI as an organization, but to ensure that communism, real or imagined, could never again function as a social force in Indonesia. And this required a system that extended beyond death squads into law, education, and economic life, embedding exclusion into everyday governance. And it was during this phase that Suharto completed his consolidation of power, gradually stripping Sukarno of authority, while presenting himself domestically and internationally as the only figure capable of restoring order after chaos. A narrative made credible precisely because the chaos had been so extreme, and this consolidation was formalized through emergency decrees, purges of the civil service, and the restructuring of political institutions to ensure permanent military influence, creating what would later be known as the New Order regime, a system that fused authoritarian control with technocratic management and unwavering anti-communism. And this system was welcomed by Western governments not merely as a stabilizing force, but as a strategic asset, because Indonesia's alignment now shifted decisively away from non-alignment toward cooperation with the United States and its allies, opening the country to foreign investment, military assistance, and integration into Cold War economic frameworks. And this shift underscored the extent to which the killings had functioned as a geopolitical realignment achieved through internal destruction rather than external pressure. And the rewards were immediate. As aid resumed, debts were renegotiated, and Indonesia was rebranded internationally as a moderate, responsible partner, even as hundreds of thousands of political prisoners remained incarcerated without trial, and millions more lived under permanent stigma, barred from employment and civic life. And this contradiction was not accidental but foundational, because the legitimacy of the new regime rested on the continued marginalization of those associated with the purge, ensuring that silence was enforced not only through fear, but through law, as identity cards marked former detainees and their families for generations, transforming political violence into hereditary exclusion. And this transformation mattered because it extended the purge's effects far beyond its immediate victims, reshaping Indonesian society through mechanisms that required no further mass killing to maintain control. And from a Cold War perspective, this was an ideal outcome, because stability was achieved without ongoing visible violence, allowing international partners to engage without confronting the origins of the regime. And this engagement reinforced the erasure of the killings from official discourse, as textbooks, media, and public commemorations adopted a singular narrative that framed the events as a heroic defense against subversion, criminalizing alternative accounts and ensuring that collective memory was policed as tightly as political activity. And this policing of memory functioned as a continuation of the purge by other means, because it denied survivors recognition and prevented society from processing trauma, embedding unresolved violence into the foundations of national identity. And this embedding had long-term consequences, as it normalized authoritarian governance and discouraged civic trust, shaping political behavior through caution and conformity rather than participation. And internationally, the Indonesian case became a quiet reference point for Cold War strategists, cited implicitly rather than openly as evidence that large-scale anti-communist realignment could be achieved through internal actors if external support was discreet and consistent, reinforcing a model of proxy violence that prioritized results over accountability. And this model would reappear in later decades under different guises, often with devastating effects. And as the Cold War continued, Indonesia's transformation was treated as a settled success, its violent origins fading from diplomatic memory even as their consequences endured, demonstrating how mass killing could be absorbed into the international system not as a scandal, but as a fait accompli. And in this sense, the Indonesian purge illustrates one of the Cold War's most unsettling dynamics, that the destruction of a political movement could be reframed as normalization, and that silence, once enforced domestically and accepted internationally, could become a form of stability, ensuring that the most consequential acts of violence were those least acknowledged. And as Indonesia entered decades of authoritarian rule, the legacy of 1965-1966 remained omnipresent yet unspoken, shaping power relations, social trust, and political possibility in ways that could not be disentangled from the Cold War logic that had enabled them. As Indonesia settled into the late 1960s under the new order, the full implications of the mass killings became visible not through continued violence, but through the architecture of governance that replaced it, because the purge had achieved something more durable than terror alone. It had reordered the relationship between state and society around the presumption that political dissent was synonymous with existential threat, and this presumption justified an expansive security apparatus that penetrated education, labor, religion, and culture, ensuring that the boundaries of acceptable thought were defined as tightly as those of acceptable action. And this reordering mattered because it transformed anti-communism from a temporary mobilization into a permanent ideology of rule, allowing emergency measures to persist under the guise of normal administration. And within this framework, the military entrenched itself as the ultimate arbiter of political life, occupying formal and informal roles that blurred civilian governance with security oversight, a fusion that reflected lessons learned during the purge. That power was most secure when it was diffuse, normalized, and insulated from scrutiny, and this insulation was reinforced by a systematic campaign to depoliticize the population replacing mass participation with technocratic management and economic growth narratives that promise stability in exchange for silence, a bargain that many accepted after the trauma of 1965-1966. Not out of consent, but out of exhaustion and fear. And internationally, this transformation was interpreted as proof that Indonesia had been rescued from chaos, a narrative that resonated strongly in Western capitals, eager for examples of successful containment in the global South. And this eagerness translated into sustained support that further entrenched the regime, providing resources and legitimacy that allowed repression to continue without the visibility of mass killing. And this invisibility mattered because it allowed the Cold War system to absorb the outcome without confronting its methods, reinforcing a pattern in which the destruction of political movements could be treated as a regrettable but acceptable cost of alignment. And for survivors and their families, the consequences were lifelong, as stigma, surveillance, and exclusion became inherited conditions, shaping opportunities and identities across generations, ensuring that the purge's effects were transmitted socially, even as they were denied historically. And this transmission created a society marked by gaps in memory and trust, where silence functioned as a survival strategy and public discourse avoided the past, not because it was forgotten, but because it remained dangerous. And this danger underscored how the purge was never truly over, because its logic continued to govern what could be said, taught, or imagined. And from a Cold War perspective, this persistence illustrates how proxy violence did not end with ceasefires or regime changes, but with the normalization of outcomes that foreclosed alternative futures, locking societies into paths shaped by terror rather than choice. And as decades passed, the Indonesian case receded into the background of Cold War history, overshadowed by wars with clearer battle lines. Yet its significance endured precisely because it demonstrated how alignment could be achieved through internal annihilation rather than external confrontation, a lesson that would influence later strategies of covert support and deniable intervention. And in this sense, the Indonesian mass killings stand not as an isolated atrocity, but as a structural event, one that reveals how the Cold War could be fought and won without headlines, through the quiet elimination of a political possibility and the construction of a state whose stability rested on enforced forgetting, a stability that appeared durable precisely because its foundations were buried, unmarked, and shielded by international silence. As the Cold War progressed into the 1970s and beyond, the Indonesian mass killings increasingly functioned as a hidden precedent rather than a remembered event, shaping international expectations about what was permissible in the struggle against communism while remaining largely absent from public discourse. Because the success of the purge in eliminating a major communist party without triggering international intervention reinforced a dangerous assumption that extreme internal violence could be tolerated, even rewarded, if it produced strategic alignment and long-term stability. And this assumption influenced how later crises were interpreted and managed, encouraging reliance on local forces and deniable support rather than overt intervention, a pattern that allowed superpowers to pursue objectives while minimizing political risk. And within Indonesia, this dynamic translated into decades of authoritarian rule, justified by the specter of a return to chaos, a specter kept alive through controlled memory and selective history, ensuring that the violence of 1965 to 1966 remained both foundational and unspeakable. And this unspeakability mattered because it prevented any genuine reckoning with the past, leaving victims without recognition and perpetrators without accountability, embedding injustice into the social fabric and shaping political behavior through caution rather than participation, And as economic growth and international integration advanced under the new order, the absence of accountability was reframed as pragmatism, reinforcing a global tendency to privilege outcomes over processes, stability over truth, and alignment over justice, a tendency deeply rooted in Cold War logic. And from a historical perspective, this reframing obscured the causal relationship between mass violence and political order, allowing the killings to be treated as a tragic prelude rather than a constitutive act, even though the regime's durability depended directly on the destruction of an entire political tradition. And this destruction had cultural as well as political consequences, erasing intellectual networks, artistic movements, and labor organizations that might have offered alternative visions of Indonesian modernity, narrowing the country's ideological landscape in ways that shaped policy and identity for generations. And internationally, the Indonesian case contributed to a broader pattern in which the Cold War's most severe human costs were concentrated in peripheral regions, where local conflicts could be intensified and resolved through terror without threatening the core balance between superpowers, a pattern that challenges narratives of Cold War restraint by revealing how restraint at the center often coincided with brutality at the margins, and as historians and journalists gradually uncovered archival evidence of foreign awareness and involvement. The killings began to be reevaluated not as spontaneous eruptions, but as coordinated campaigns embedded in a global context of fear and competition, forcing a reconsideration of responsibility that extended beyond national borders. And this reconsideration remains incomplete because the structures that benefited from the purge have had little incentive to confront its origins. And the international system that absorbed the outcome has rarely acknowledged its role, leaving the Indonesian mass killings suspended between history and silence, known yet unaccounted for. And in this sense, the events of 1965-1966 illustrate one of the Cold War's most enduring legacies, that violence carried out in the name of stability can become invisible once it succeeds, its victims erased from policy memory, even as its results are normalized. And it is this invisibility, more than the brutality itself, that explains how one of the largest anti-communist purges in history could shape a nation's future while remaining marginal in global consciousness. A reminder that the Cold War was fought not only through dramatic crises and proxy wars, but through acts of annihilation whose very effectiveness ensured their obscurity, locking entire societies into paths defined by fear, silence, and the long shadow of unacknowledged violence. As the Cold War drew toward its later decades, the Indonesian mass killings remained a silent cornerstone of the regional order that had emerged from the violence, because the absence of reckoning allowed the political settlement forged through terror to harden into convention, shaping not only Indonesia's internal governance, but its role within a broader anti-communist alignment across Southeast Asia. And this mattered because it demonstrated how proxy violence could produce durable geopolitical outcomes without the formal markers of war or treaty, embedding alignment through fear rather than consent. And within Indonesia, the long-term effects were visible in the persistence of laws, institutions, and social hierarchies that traced their legitimacy back to the purge, as emergency regulations evolved into permanent security statutes and military influence over civilian life remained normalized, reinforcing a culture in which political stability was equated with obedience and historical inquiry was treated as subversion. And this culture constrained democratic development long after the Cold War context that had justified it began to fade, because the foundations of the state had been built on the exclusion of a vast segment of society whose voices could not be reintegrated without destabilizing the narrative of national salvation. And this narrative was maintained through education, media, and ritual commemoration that celebrated the defeat of communism while omitting the human cost, ensuring that collective memory served power rather than truth. And internationally, the durability of Indonesia's alignment reinforced confidence in similar approaches elsewhere, encouraging the belief that internal purges, if framed as spontaneous or culturally rooted, could achieve strategic ends with minimal reputational cost, a belief that underestimated the long-term damage such violence inflicted on social trust and political legitimacy. And from a historical perspective, the Indonesian case thus exposes a central contradiction of Cold War containment, that the pursuit of stability often required actions that undermine the very principles of self-determination and human rights that Western powers claimed to defend, creating a gap between rhetoric and practice that would later erode moral authority. And this erosion mattered because it shaped how post-Cold War interventions were received, particularly in regions that had experienced violence justified by anti-communism, fostering skepticism toward international norms that had failed to protect them. And as archival materials and survivor testimonies slowly emerged after the fall of the New Order, the killings began to be re-examined not as an aberration, but as a deliberate strategy enabled by global context, forcing a reconsideration of responsibility that extended beyond national borders to include the international system that had rewarded the outcome. And this reconsideration remains contested because acknowledging the purge as a foundational act of Cold War violence challenges comforting narratives of containment as restraint, revealing instead a pattern in which restraint at the superpower level coexisted with permissiveness toward mass atrocity at the periphery. And in this sense, the Indonesian mass killings stand as a defining example of how the Cold War reshaped societies through mechanisms that left few visible traces but profound scars, altering political trajectories through silence as much as force. And as the century closed and new generations confronted the legacy of 1965-1966, the unresolved tension between memory and denial continued to shape Indonesian politics, demonstrating that the true end of the purge had never been declared, only absorbed into normality, and that its significance lies not only in the scale of death, but in the way it revealed how global, ideological struggle could legitimize annihilation, producing a stability that endured precisely because its origins were buried, unmarked, and shielded from accountability. A stability that serves as a stark reminder that some of the Cold War's most consequential battles were fought not to win hearts or territory, but to erase political possibilities entirely. In the longer arc of Cold War history, the Indonesian mass killings force a confrontation with how power was exercised most effectively not through spectacle, but through disappearance, because the purge succeeded precisely by eliminating not only people, but the conditions under which their absence could be questioned. And this success reshaped Indonesia's political trajectory in ways that were both durable and difficult to reverse, as the state that emerged was built on an implicit pact of silence that traded historical truth for stability. And this pact was reinforced by international acceptance that treated the outcome as a fait accompli rather than a moral failure, allowing the violence to recede from global attention, even as its consequences structured everyday life. And this dynamic illustrates a broader Cold War pattern in which peripheral societies absorbed the costs of ideological competition, while central powers preserved the appearance of restraint, creating a global order that was stable in form but brutal in substance. And within Indonesia, the purge's legacy persisted through generational transmission of fear, as children inherited the stigma attached to their parents and learned to navigate a society where political identity could determine access to education, employment, and security, embedding inequality into the fabric of citizenship. And this embedding mattered because it ensured that the violence of 1965-1966 remained active long after the killings ended, shaping behavior through anticipation rather than force. And internationally, the Indonesian case became a quiet benchmark, cited implicitly in policy circles as evidence that anti-communist realignment could be achieved without overt intervention, reinforcing a preference for deniable influence and local execution that would recur in later conflicts under different ideological banners. And from a historical perspective, this preference reveals how the Cold War's legacy cannot be measured solely by avoided wars or negotiated treaties, because it also includes the normalization of mass violence as a tool of order, a normalization that undermined international norms while appearing to uphold stability. And as scholars and survivors have sought to recover the suppressed history of the purge, their efforts have exposed not only domestic repression but international complicity, forcing a reevaluation of responsibility that challenges comfortable narratives of Cold War success. And this reevaluation remains incomplete because full acknowledgement would require confronting the ways in which strategic objectives were prioritized over human life, a reckoning that many institutions have been reluctant to undertake. And in this sense, the Indonesian mass killings endure as an unresolved chapter, one that continues to shape debates about memory, justice, and the ethics of intervention, reminding us that the Cold War's most decisive outcomes were often those achieved quietly through the erasure of alternatives and the institutionalization of fear, leaving behind societies that appeared stable while carrying the unspoken weight of violence that had made that stability possible. As the Cold War entered its final years and the global ideological struggle that had framed the Indonesian purge began to recede, the events of 1965-1966 did not resolve themselves into history so much as they remained embedded in the structures of power that survived the era, because the collapse of global communism did not automatically dismantle the political order that had been built on its violent eradication. And this persistence revealed how thoroughly the purge had succeeded in shaping not just alignment, but governance itself, leaving Indonesia with institutions and narratives that no longer required an external enemy to justify repression. Only the memory of one, carefully curated and selectively invoked. And this mattered because it demonstrated that Cold War violence could outlive the Cold War, its logic internalized and reproduced without reference to the global struggle that had originally legitimized it. And within Indonesia, the gradual opening that followed the end of the new order did not immediately translate into reckoning, because decades of enforced silence had fragmented memory and discouraged collective inquiry, making truth-seeking itself a politically risky act. And this fragmentation was compounded by the absence of accountability, as many of those who had overseen or benefited from the purge remained influential, reinforcing the incentives to preserve ambiguity rather than confront responsibility. And internationally, the end of the Cold War did little to prompt reassessment, because the strategic outcome achieved in Indonesia had long since been absorbed into the global order, its violent origins treated as historical collateral rather than a continuing moral claim. And this indifference underscored how the Cold War's end did not erase its ethical debts, only obscured them. And from a historical perspective, the Indonesian mass killings thus occupy a liminal space, neither fully acknowledged nor fully denied, shaping political culture through absence rather than presence. And this absence has consequences because it limits the capacity for democratic renewal by leaving foundational violence unaddressed, constraining trust and participation in ways that are difficult to measure but deeply felt. And as new generations encounter the past through fragments and testimonies rather than official narratives, the struggle over memory becomes itself a political arena, revealing how the Cold War continues to exert influence not through ideology, but through unresolved trauma. And in this sense, the Indonesian purge illustrates one of the Cold War's most enduring legacies, that the pursuit of stability through annihilation can produce orders that persist precisely because they silence their own origins, leaving behind a peace that is structurally intact, yet morally unsettled. And as historians continue to reconstruct the events of 1965-1966 in their international context, the killings stand as a stark reminder that some of the most consequential Cold War battles were fought without declarations, without treaties, and without closure, their outcomes locked into place by fear, denial, and the quiet acceptance of a world willing to look away so long as alignment was secured. In closing, the Indonesian mass killings of 1965-1966 stand as one of the Cold War's most devastating yet least acknowledged turning points because they revealed with brutal clarity how global ideological conflict could be resolved not through negotiation, reform, or even conventional war, but through the physical eradication of a political alternative and the subsequent normalization of silence. And what makes the episode so significant is not only the scale of death, but the way in which that death was absorbed into a new political order that presented itself as stability, transforming mass violence into a foundation rather than a rupture. And this transformation mattered because it demonstrated how Cold War alignment could be secured decisively without direct superpower confrontation, using local actors to achieve outcomes that reshaped an entire nation while insulating external sponsors from accountability. And in Indonesia, this produced a regime whose legitimacy rested on fear, exclusion, and enforced forgetting, embedding the purge into law, education, and identity so thoroughly that the violence no longer needed to be repeated to remain effective. And internationally, it produced a precedent that haunted the Cold War's periphery, reinforcing the belief that annihilation, if successful and discreet, could be treated as order. And as the Cold War ended and new global narratives emerged, the Indonesian killings remained suspended between history and denial, their victims unacknowledged and their perpetrators largely unchallenged, illustrating how the end of ideological rivalry did not automatically dissolve the structures built in its name. And this unresolved legacy underscores why the Indonesian case cannot be understood merely as a domestic tragedy or a regional anomaly, but as a central expression of Cold War logic at its most extreme, where fear of alignment loss justified mass murder and silence became the price of stability. And as historians, survivors, and future generations continue to confront the buried history of 1965-1966, the killings remain a warning etched into the fabric of the Cold War's aftermath, reminding us that some of its most decisive victories were achieved not by winning hearts or territory, but by erasing political possibilities so completely that their absence could be mistaken for peace, leaving behind a nation aligned, stable, and profoundly scarred by a violence that was never meant to be remembered.